The sealed letter trembled between my fingers as Lucian walked past me toward a room full of drawn swords. Lucian. My voice barely crossed the torchlit corridor, yet he stopped with one hand against the council chamber door. Beyond it, commanders shouted over a map table. Steel scraped against stone. Wax smoke and the sharp scent of anxious wolves thickened the air. Beneath my gray cloak, the ivory sleeve of my wedding dress brushed my wrist, soft as the promise we had planned to make before midnight. No court, no witnesses, only him and me in the old moon chapel. I held out the letter. His eyes dropped to the unbroken silver seal, then lifted to my face. What is it? Something I need you to keep. My thumb pressed into the folded parchment until its edge cut my skin. Before we go to the chapel, a horn sounded from the eastern wall, one deep note followed by two short blasts. Lucian turned toward the narrow window. Torchlight caught the hard line of his jaw. His wolf rose close enough to sharpen the gold in his eyes. The border patrol found rebel tracks less than 3 miles from the palace, he said. Tonight of all nights. I stepped closer. The heat of him reached me through the cold corridor, familiar and painful. Then read it now. Elara, I don't have time for riddles. It isn't a riddle. I placed the letter against his palm, but his fingers did not close around it. Behind the door, a commander called. Your Majesty, the western gate may be compromised. Lucian's attention shifted at once. Mine did not. I watched the pulse beat beneath the scar at his throat and remembered how gently he had spoken in the chapel that morning, when no crown rested on his head and no counselor stood between us. Meet me after the coronation feast, he had whispered. Come as my bride. Now he looked every inch the Alpha King, shoulders rigid beneath black armor, signet ring gleaming like ice, duty sealing every opening through which tenderness might have reached him. If tonight I don't come back. The unfinished words changed something in his face, but only for a breath. He caught my wrist and lowered the letter between us. His grip was controlled, never cruel, though the metal of his gauntlet bit cold against my skin. Back from where? I could not tell him. Not there, with guards posted at both ends of the corridor and council ears behind carved oak. I had promised myself I would explain after I confirmed what I had seen near the ceremonial cellars. If I was wrong, I would not poison our wedding night with suspicion. If I was right, the palace itself was no longer safe. Please, I whispered. Just take it. Another horn split the air. This one came from inside the walls. The council door opened, spilling yellow light across Lucian's boots. Lord Vaylor stood beyond the threshold with several armed commanders at his back. Majesty, we require your order. Lucian released me. The sudden absence of his hand felt colder than the stone beneath my slippers. Wait in the chapel, he said. I may be delayed. Lucian, not now. His voice struck the corridor flat. Several guards looked away, but they had heard. An Omega interrupting her king. An Omega foolish enough to expect his attention while rebellion pressed against his gates. He glanced at the envelope still in my hand. Whatever private fear this is, it can wait until I have secured the realm. And if it can't, he stepped toward the council chamber. I moved with him once, the skirt hidden beneath my cloak whispering over the floor. If this is the last chance I have to say goodbye? He paused without turning. For one heartbeat, I thought he would come back. I thought he would see the dress beneath my cloak, take the letter, or ask why my hands would not stop shaking. Instead, his shoulders hardened. Do not disturb me again tonight. The doors closed behind him. The iron latch fell with a sound like a blade laid across a grave. I remained there until the torch beside me hissed and spat resin. Then I knelt, picked up the letter that had slipped from my numb fingers, and smoothed the bent corner against my knee. From the council chamber came Lucian's measured commands. Seal the roads, double the guard, search every wagon entering the inner court. He was preparing to defend his crown. He had no idea I had been trying to defend him. I tucked the unopened goodbye inside the lining of my cloak and turned toward the servants' stairs instead of the moon chapel. As I passed an alcove overlooking the coronation courtyard, a wagon rolled below, its wheels grinding over frost-white stones. 6 barrels of ceremonial wine sat beneath a canvas sheet. On the nearest wooden lid, briefly exposed to torchlight, someone had burned a black crescent pierced by 3 claws. I had seen that mark once before, on the rebels who swore the Alpha King would not survive his coronation. The wagon disappeared beneath the palace arch, and I was the only one who had noticed. The wagon's iron-rimmed wheels rattled beneath the arch, and the black crescent vanished under a fold of wet canvas. Cold air streamed through the alcove, carrying the sharp scent of pine smoke and spiced wine. Elara hurried down the servants' stairs, one hand holding her cloak closed over the letter hidden inside its lining. By the time she reached the coronation courtyard, kitchen servants were already rolling the barrels toward the lower cellars. Torchlight slid across brass hoops and frost-darkened oak. The marked barrel stood third in line. "Stop," she called. A steward turned, his silver chain glinting against his uniform. His gaze moved from her plain cloak to the pale omega band at her wrist. "Those casks are sealed for the coronation. One bears a rebel mark." Elara pointed, but a servant rolled the barrel forward, turning the scorched lid toward the wall. The steward did not look. His Majesty ordered every delivery searched. "Then search it again." The courtyard quieted around her. Somewhere above, a bell tolled the quarter hour, its iron note vibrating through the frozen stones. The steward's mouth tightened. "Do not turn your nerves into an accusation, Omega. Return to your duties." Two guards stepped between her and the wine. Their leather armor smelled of oil and snow. Elara could have shouted until the council chamber heard her. Without the visible mark, she would only become a disturbance Lucian had no patience left to forgive. So she lowered her eyes. Of course. She retreated beneath the colonnade, waited until the servants resumed their work, then slipped through a linen passage running beside the cellar wall. The stone there was damp and bitterly cold beneath her fingertips. Through narrow ventilation slits, she followed the scrape of barrels over flagstones and counted each turn of the wheels. 1, 2, 3. The marked cask did not join the others in the coronation vault. A hooded porter intercepted it at the final junction and pressed 2 fingers to the black crescent. Another servant opened an unlisted door behind a rack of winter provisions. Elara caught the scent that escaped before the door shut, not wine, but lamp oil, metal, and the faint medicinal bitterness of wolfsbane. Her pulse struck hard against the letter over her heart. The rebels were not merely smuggling poison into the palace. They were using the coronation shipment to move something else beneath the royal guard's nose. When the corridor emptied, she crossed to the hidden door. Fresh mud marked the floor, threaded with pale straw from the outer stables. She knelt and found a broken strand of sealing wax near the threshold. The wax was royal blue, but pressed into it was the same 3-clawed crescent. Footsteps sounded behind her. Elara swept the fragment into her sleeve and rose as a young cellar keeper rounded the corner with a lantern. Its flame trembled, throwing both their shadows across the wall. "This passage is restricted. I lost a clasp while delivering linens. There are no linens stored here." His hand moved toward the alarm cord. Elara seized a nearby inventory slate and shoved it into his arms. Clay jars toppled from the stack beside him, bursting across the floor with a crash and a cloud of flour. While he coughed and cursed, she slipped through the settling white dust and climbed the narrow stairs toward the servants' gallery. Behind her, the alarm cord remained untouched. For now, at the top landing, warmth from the council wing rolled over her, heavy with beeswax and burning cedar. Lucian's voice carried through the carved doors as he issued orders to protect the roads beyond the capital. Elara stopped with her palm against the wood. The danger was already beneath his feet, and those empowered to guard him had dismissed the only warning they had received. She drew out the wax fragment. Reporting it would mean surrendering it to the same palace chain that had waved the barrel through. Running would preserve her secret, her freedom, perhaps even the fragile future she had once imagined beside him. Instead, she tucked the fragment beside her unopened goodbye and looked back toward the concealed cellar passage. If proof was the only language the court respected, she would bring Lucian proof no one could bury. Before the next bell, Elara turned away from the council chamber and descended toward the guarded heart of the palace. Cold air breathed through the hidden stairwell, carrying the bitter tang of iron and wolfsbane from below. Beyond the stone, boots struck the floor in measured pairs. Elara waited until the patrol passed, then pressed the stolen wax fragment into a shallow impression beside the concealed door. The lock clicked. Crossing that threshold meant more than disobedience. Omegas were forbidden from entering the royal armory under penalty of exile. She slipped inside anyway. Blue witch lamps cast a frozen sheen across racks of silver-edged swords and sealed crates stacked nearly 10 feet high. The room smelled of oiled leather, cedar shavings, and metal cold enough to sting her fingertips. Elara moved past the weapons, searching for whatever the false wine shipment had been meant to conceal. Near the rear wall, fresh scratches marked the floor beneath an empty spear rack. She braced both hands against the wood and pushed. It shifted aside, revealing not another suspicious symbol, but an assassination already prepared for use. Palace guard cloaks, crossbows wound and loaded, and a leather map showing the route Lucian would take from the council chamber to the moon chapel. A black line ended at the narrow western arcade, where no royal escort could surround him. Beside it lay a sealed command sheet. Elara lifted it toward the blue flame. The royal seal looked flawless, yet the wax was softer than the palace blend and carried the same burnt cedar scent clinging to the fragment in her pocket. For words had been written beneath the route in a precise hand. The king must fall before midnight. At the bottom stood the authority that would move soldiers without question. Lord Vaylor, Council of the Crown. A hinge groaned behind her. Elara spun as the armory captain entered with 2 guards. His eyes moved from her gray omega cloak to the forged order in her hand. Put that down. Read it first. She held the page toward him. Vaylor has placed assassins inside the palace. The captain did not look at the writing. His thumb settled against the alarm lever beside the door. Lord Vaylor warned us a traitor might enter tonight. The betrayal was not hidden anymore. It had rank, keys, and armed men waiting to obey it. Elara tore the route map from the table and seized the command sheet before the captain pulled the lever. A bronze bell thundered above them. Its vibration shook dust from the ceiling and rolled through the palace like an iron heartbeat. Elara of the lower household, the captain shouted, drawing his sword. You are charged with breaching the royal armory and stealing crown intelligence. Red alarm light flooded the chamber. The 2 guards advanced, blocking the door, but Elara kicked the spear rack back across their path. Wood crashed against stone. She ran between the crates as a crossbow bolt struck the wall beside her, showering her cheek with chips of mortar. The rear passage ended at an arrow slit barely wide enough for her shoulders. Below it, the forest canopy moved like black water under the wind. 30 feet. No stairs. No time. Elara wrapped the forged order inside the route map, bound both beneath her cloak, and climbed onto the ledge. A guard caught the hem as she jumped. Cloth ripped. She dropped onto the steep slate roof, struck hard, then slid toward the edge while bells answered one another from every tower. Her fingers closed around a rain gutter. Cold metal cut into her palms. Below, a supply cart rolled through the inner yard. Elara released her grip and landed among coarse sacks of grain, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Voices erupted behind her. Seal the gates. The Omega has the king's military plans. By the time the cart reached the servants' arch, riders were already spreading the charge she had not been allowed to answer. Traitor. Thief. Fugitive. Elara rolled from the wagon into wet grass and ran as the portcullis descended, iron teeth striking sparks inches behind her. Moonlight flashed across the torn edge of her cloak as she crossed the outer field. Ahead, the pine forest opened in a wall of darkness. Behind, royal hounds took her scent. The wedding she had hidden beneath ivory silk was gone now. So was any lawful path back to Lucian. Elara tightened one hand over the proof against her ribs and vanished beneath the trees while the palace herald called her betrayal into the night. Before midnight, every soldier in Lucian's kingdom would be hunting the only person carrying the truth that could keep him alive. Rain hammered the council chamber windows as a blood-red marker slid across the kingdom map. The fugitive crossed the western field 6 minutes before the gates fell, the captain reported. Lucian stood at the head of the black oak table, one hand braced beside the capital's silver seal. Firelight sharpened the hard line of his jaw, but his gaze remained fixed on the open door behind the captain, as if Elara might still appear there with an explanation. Lord Vaylor broke the silence. She entered the royal armory, stole restricted military documents, and fled when challenged. 3 guards identified her. A leather evidence case struck the table. Its straps were cut, its contents missing. Lucian recognized it at once. Earlier that evening, it had rested beside his chair while Elara stood in the corridor, holding out her sealed letter. If tonight I don't come back. The memory reached him in her voice, quiet, strained, unfinished. His fingers curled against the map. Was she searched before she entered the lower halls? No, Your Majesty. Did anyone see her pass those documents to a rebel contact? The captain hesitated. Rain rattled the glass. No, Valor leaned into the candlelight, his counsel chain whispering against dark velvet. Because she escaped before we could learn whom she serves. Every hour of delay gives her time to deliver your defenses to the insurgents. Lucian's wolf pressed beneath his skin, not with the clean fury of battle, but with a restless ache that made Elara's absence feel wrong. Her scent still clung faintly to his sleeve, lavender, winter apples, smoke from the Moonchapel candles. He could have opened her letter. He had chosen not to. A scout rushed through the doors, wet boots skidding across stone. We found her trail at the pine forest. She doubled toward the western road. Lucian looked down at the narrow route cutting between the forest and the border watchtowers. It was the fastest way out of the kingdom. It was also the fastest road back toward the royal procession's route at dawn. Two meanings. One choice. Valor placed a silver command stylus beside Lucian's hand. If she reaches the frontier, the plans are lost. The Alpha King lifted his gaze. Seal every border crossing. The captain stiffened. Even the western road? Especially the western road. Raise the iron barriers. Double the patrols. No traveler passes without my order. The command landed with the weight of a portcullis. Horns answered from the outer towers, low and mournful, carrying through the rain-dark capital. Red signal flames sprang to life along the battlements, one after another, until the distant ridgelines burned like a chain of warning eyes. Lucian pressed the royal seal into hot wax. By law, the order could not be reversed by any commander beneath him. Beyond the palace, Elara emerged from the pines with mud cold around her ankles and the stolen evidence bound beneath her torn cloak. Royal hounds called somewhere behind her, their cries weaving through the wet branches. Ahead, the western watchtower rose above the road. For one brief moment, its gate remained open. Then the king's horn rolled across the valley. Iron gears groaned. The barrier descended, and soldiers flooded onto the road with crossbows raised. Elara stopped beneath the dripping trees. The proof against the council member lay inches from her heartbeat. The palace stood behind the very men ordered to capture her. A mounted herald unfurled Lucian's black and silver banner. By command of the Alpha King, all borders are closed. Elara is to be taken alive and returned in chains. Her hand closed around the letter-shaped space inside her cloak where his unopened farewell had once rested. She could not outrun riders on an open road. She could not approach the palace without surrendering the evidence to whoever had corrupted its guards. And now Lucian himself had barred her path. Back in the council chamber, the last drop of black wax cooled beneath the royal seal. Lucian released the stylus, but it left a crescent-shaped cut in his palm. "Bring her to me," he said. Far beyond the windows, another horn answered. This one from the route his own dawn escort would take. Elara heard it too. Her face lifted toward the sound, and the paper hidden against her ribs crackled beneath her tightening grip. The border offered safety only if she abandoned him. Behind her, the hunt drew closer. Before her, Lucian's sealed road waited. By sunrise, she would have to choose which order to defy. The western gate chains groaned through the rain as soldiers dragged them across the road. Torchlight shivered on wet armor, and beyond the barricade, the forest opened toward freedom, dark, unguarded, close enough for Elara to taste the pine on the wind. Behind her, the royal hounds crashed through the undergrowth. She had only seconds. Then the dawn horn sounded again, followed by two short notes and one long. The escort signal. Elara froze beside the ditch. From the ridge above the road came the scrape of boots against stone, too measured for hunters and too quiet for royal guards. Through the dripping branches, she saw hooded figures fastening silver-tipped bolts into crossbows. Below them, the king's route curved through a narrow ravine. Lucian would ride directly beneath their weapons. Elara looked toward the open forest. One step would hide her. 10 more could save her. Her fingers closed around the stolen documents beneath her cloak, their edges softened by rain and sweat. Then she turned her back on the border. Not without him. The ivory dress lay where she had hidden it inside the hollow trunk of an ancient oak. Elara pulled away the oilcloth, and moonpale silk spilled over her hands. It still carried the faint scent of lavender from the chapel and the warmth of a future that had existed only hours ago. Wearing it now would make her visible from half a mile away. It would also tell every royal soldier exactly who she was. The woman whispered about in servants' corridors. The bride who had been expected at the moon chapel before the palace branded her a traitor. She stripped off her mud-dark cloak. Cold rain struck her shoulders as she drew the wedding dress over her head. The hem soaked black at once, and briars caught the delicate sleeves when she climbed from the ditch. She tore them free without slowing. Behind her, the hounds broke into the clearing. "There!" a soldier shouted. "The fugitive!" Elara stepped into the torchlight and raised both empty hands. The evidence crackled beneath the fitted bodice, pressed against her heart. A young guard lowered his spear, but recognition loosened his grip. His gaze moved from her face to the ivory silk, then to the silver moon threads stitched around its collar. "You're the king's. His escort is riding into an ambush." Hooves thundered faintly through the ravine. The sound changed every face. Captain Rice reached for her arm. "By royal order, you are under arrest." Elara seized the shaft of his spear and pulled herself close enough that only he could hear her over the rain. "Arrest me after he lives." A crossbow string snapped on the ridge. The bolt struck the barricade, burying itself in the timber where the captain's head had been. Soldiers scattered. Elara did not. She tore one folded page from her bodice and thrust it against Rice's breastplate. Valor's seal gleamed beneath the smeared wax beside the written route of the king's dawn procession. The captain read 2 lines. His face emptied. "Open the gate," he ordered. "The king sealed it himself," another guard said. "Then I will answer to him myself." "Open it." Chains fell. Timber scraped over stone, leaving a gap barely wide enough for a horse. Elara caught the bridle of the nearest mount and climbed into the saddle before anyone could stop her. The soaked skirt clung heavily around her legs. White silk flashed beneath the torches like a surrender banner. It was the opposite. "Give me 6 riders," she said. "You are still accused of treason." Rice looked once more at Valor's seal, then drew his sword. "You have 6. They burst through the opening as rebel bolts hissed from the trees. Instead of fleeing the shots, Elara drove uphill, forcing the assassins to turn away from the approaching royal procession. The riders followed her through wet ferns and loose shale until the ravine appeared below. Black banners moved between the cliffs. At their center rode Lucian, unaware that 12 crossbows were being raised above him. Elara pulled the remaining evidence free and held it overhead. "Royal Guard." Her voice cut across the stone. "Protect your king." Lucian looked up. Even through the rain, she saw the instant he recognized the dress. His horse reared as his guards wheeled toward the ridge. The assassins abandoned concealment and surged from the rocks, closing the road between them. Elara pressed her heels into the horse's flanks. Ivory silk streamed behind her as she carried the proof straight through the broken line. For the first time that night, Lucian was looking directly at her. But between them, silver flashed. Rain turned the ravine into a blur of black stone and silver light. Above the clash of steel, a crossbow string snapped. Elara saw the bolt streak toward Lucian and flung the documents into Captain Rice's reach. The plans bear Valor's seal. Then she drove her horse between the king and the ridge. The bolt struck the saddle instead of Lucian, throwing leather and splinters into the rain. His guards closed around him, but an assassin burst through their formation with a narrow blade gleaming pale beneath the storm. Wolfsbane sharpened its bitter scent. "Silver." Lucian tore his sword free, yet his rearing horse carried him one fatal stride backward. Elara jumped from her saddle. Ivory skirts dragged across the mud as she crossed the gap, seized the assassin's wrist, and turned the blade away from the king. Its edge entered her side. Cold spread beneath her ribs before pain found her. Lucian's roar shook the cliffs. He struck the attacker down with the flat of his sword and reached for her, but smoke jars shattered against the road. Gray clouds swallowed the riders, stinging eyes and throats with lamp oil and wolfsbane. Elara, through the smoke, she felt his fingers brush hers. Then a hooked arm locked around her waist. Rebels pulled her backward while another seized the blood-spattered silk of her dress. Elara kicked free of one man and reached toward Lucian's voice, but her wounded leg folded beneath her. Wet cloth ripped across her shoulder. A rebel sliced through the gown to free it from a thorned branch, leaving most of the ivory skirt in the mud as they dragged her into a narrow cleft between the rocks. By the time Lucian broke through the smoke, only torn silk remained beneath his boots. "West Trail," Captain Rice shouted. 3 riders took her alive. Lucian turned toward the trees, rain streaming from his jaw, but a second cry rose behind him. 2 guards were pinned beneath a fallen horse, and bolts still fell from the ridge. Elara had put herself between him and Silver. Now his wounded escort stood between him and pursuit. He drove his blade into its sheath and took command. "Clear the ridge. Keep one breathing." His voice was low enough to freeze every guard who heard it. "Rice, with me." The attack plans led them away from the ravine to an abandoned hunting lodge less than 2 miles west. Its chapel room had been prepared for the secret vows Lucian had promised Elara after dawn. Candles waited unlit beside a moonstone altar. White winter roses had browned at their edges, and rain tapped softly against the leaded windows. No rebels remained. No Elara. In the center of the room lay her wedding dress. The torn gown had been spread across the floor as if someone wanted it found. Mud darkened the hem. Blood covered the bodice and one sleeve. Crimson against ivory. Carrying the metallic scent of the wound, he had been too far away to stop. Lucian dropped to one knee. The silk was still warm. His hand closed over it, then stopped when stiff paper crackled inside the hidden seam. He drew out a folded letter marked with his name in Elara's careful hand. The seal was unbroken. The same letter she had tried to give him before he walked away. Captain Rice entered behind him with Vaylor's attack plans protected beneath his cloak. "Your Majesty, the trail divides north of the lodge. If they cross the river, we lose them before sunrise." Lucian stared at the unopened letter while rainwater gathered beneath his boots. On the floor, the dress Elara had worn so his soldiers would recognize her no longer looked like bridal silk. It looked like the cost of his refusal to listen. Outside, a horn sounded once from the northern woods. A prisoner's signal, or a warning that time had already run out. Lucian broke the seal. Candlelight trembled across the opened page, turning Elara's careful handwriting gold at the edges. Rain tapped the chapel windows, and beneath it came the low, fading call of the horn in the northern woods. Lucian read the first line without breathing. "My king, if this letter reaches you, then I failed to say goodbye while you could still hear me." The paper tightened between his fingers. Captain Rice stood near the doorway, water dripping from his cloak onto the cold stone, but Lucian lifted one hand for silence. The letter continued. Elara had named Lord Vaylor plainly. His private seal marked the assassination plans. His agents had hidden wolfsbane among the coronation wine and armed rebels along the dawn escort route. She had written every detail before entering the royal armory, not knowing whether she would return with proof or be condemned for seeking it. Rice placed the recovered plans beside the letter. The black wax impressed on both documents bore the same split crown emblem. No uncertainty remained. "She knew," Rice said quietly. Lucian's gaze moved to the torn wedding dress. Its ivory silk clung darkly to the chapel floor, and the faint scent of Elara's blood lingered beneath wet cedar and burned candlewick. "She knew before any of us." Another line waited below Vaylor's name. The ink there was uneven, as though Elara's hand had paused. "There is one truth I kept from you because once spoken, it would force you to choose between your throne and me." Lucian's wolf surged beneath his skin. Heat flashed through his veins, answered by the fading trace of her scent in the room. He read on. Elara had recognized their mate bond weeks earlier, in the palace garden, when Lucian touched her wrist beneath the moon lanterns. She had felt the answering pull each time he entered a room, but concealed it because royal law required an Alpha King to take a highborn Luna approved by the council. An Omega bride would give Vaylor the division he needed. Nobles would challenge Lucian. Allied pacts might withdraw. Blood could follow her name through the kingdom. "So I chose to leave after our secret vows," she had written. "Not because I doubted what I felt, but because I would not make your people pay for it." Lucian lowered the page. The letter did not shake. His hand did. That morning, Elara had stood before him with this truth pressed between her palms. She had offered him the only warning she believed she might survive long enough to give, and he had looked past her to the guards waiting at the door. "Don't trouble me tonight." His own words returned with perfect clarity, colder than the rain seeping beneath the chapel threshold. He had mistaken restraint for distance, secrecy for betrayal, and her flight through the forest for guilt. Then he had sealed the western road. Not Valor, not the rebels. Lucian had closed her last lawful path home. The chair beside him scraped sharply as he rose. "Send riders to every border post," he ordered. "Elara is cleared of treason. Any soldier who restrains her answers directly to me." Rice moved at once, but Lucian caught his arm before he reached the door. "And issue a warrant for Lord Valor under the royal seal. No council immunity. No private hearing." That command changed the air. Arresting a council lord without approval could fracture the crown before sunrise. Rice searched his face. "The council will call this an act of tyranny." Lucian folded Elara's letter and placed it inside his coat, against his heartbeat. "They called her a traitor because I made silence easy for them." Outside, hoofbeats approached through the mud. A royal scout stumbled into the chapel, breathing hard, his leather gloves streaked with river clay. "Captain, the northern trail ends at the old ferry. We found rebel tracks and a strip of ivory cloth on the bank. The boat is still on this side." Rice turned toward the windows. The darkness beyond them had begun to thin into the gray before dawn. "Then they haven't crossed," he said. "Not yet." A second horn answered from the forest, closer now. 3 notes. The signal for a royal prisoner facing judgment. Lucian fastened his sword belt and walked across Elara's bloodstained veil without touching it. At the chapel doors, he stopped only long enough to look back at the place where they had meant to promise themselves in secret. "Ready the wolves," he said. "Before sunrise, Valor loses either his hostage or his crown." 3 sharp blasts split the fog above the old ferry, followed by the iron clatter of weapons being drawn. Pale dawn glazed the river, and wet ropes creaked against the dock as Lucian rode out of the pines with Captain Rice and the royal guard behind him. Elara stood at the end of the pier beneath Valor's raised blade, her wrists bound, her face drained white from the silver wound. Rebel archers lined the bank. "One step closer," Valor called, "and your precious Omega dies." Lucian dismounted. Instead of reaching for his sword, he removed the golden council chain from his shoulders and dropped it into the mud. "Hear your king," he said, his voice carrying across the cold water. Rice raised the royal signal horn, and its answering call rolled through the forest toward every nearby outpost. Lucian faced the guards, the rebels, and the council witnesses Valor had brought to legitimize Elara's execution. By royal decree, the council's authority over succession, marriage, and the choosing of a Luna ends today. Lord Valor is stripped of immunity and charged with treason. Valor's blade pressed closer. "Without our recognition, you cannot take a highborn Luna. Your line loses the old houses. Then let them go." Lucian pulled the ceremonial signet from his hand, the seal granting kings the privilege of choosing a noble bride over a fated mate, and crushed it beneath his boot. Metal snapped against stone. "I surrender that privilege freely. No council will choose the woman beside me." A murmur moved along the pier. Several rebels lowered their bows, but Valor seized Elara's shoulder and dragged her toward the ferry. Lucian advanced alone, boots striking the rain-dark planks. "Release her. Order your wolves back." Valor nodded toward the royal ranks. "Let us cross, or she pays for your stubbornness." Elara's gaze found Lucian through the mist. Her fingers had already worked one hand loose from the rope. He saw the raw mark at her wrist and the quiet calculation in her eyes. Beneath Valor's cloak, she caught hold of a packet sealed in oilskin, the recovered attack plans. "I can go with them," she said. Her voice was faint, but the river carried it. "If that prevents the packs from dividing, let me end it." Lucian stopped several yards away. Once, he had answered her choice with an order. Now he unbuckled his sword and laid it on the pier. "No," Valor smiled. Lucian looked only at Elara. "I will not command you to stay. I will not command you to sacrifice yourself. Decide what happens next, and the crown will answer to you." The words changed the silence. Elara stared at the weapon on the boards, then at the soldiers waiting for Lucian to seize control. Warm blood darkened the bandage beneath her borrowed cloak, yet her loosened hand remained steady. She ripped the plans from Valor's belt and held his seal toward the council witnesses. "You were told the king planned to dissolve your houses," she called. "These orders prove Valor planned to murder him, blame the Western Pax, and crown himself regent." Valor lunged for the pages. Elara stepped beyond his reach and cast them across the wet pier. Sheets slid to the boots of rebels and royal guards alike, each bearing the same black wax seal. Rice lifted one for all to see. "The seals match," he declared. "So do the attack positions at the ravine." The archers' bows lowered one after another. No royal charge broke the rebellion. Elara's evidence broke it from within. Valor turned toward the ferry, but the rebels who had guarded it blocked his path. Lucian did not move until Elara gave a single nod. Only then did Rice cross the pier and lock iron around Valor's wrists. The former council lord twisted toward Lucian. "You have traded a kingdom for an omega." "No," Elara said, swaying but upright. "He returned the kingdom its choice." Lucian reached her without claiming her hand. He held his palm open between them, waiting. After a long breath, she placed her fingers in his. The warmth of the bond stirred beneath her chilled skin, but the decision came before it. Behind them, daylight spread over the broken seal and scattered plans. Ahead, bells began ringing from the capital, some in allegiance, others in defiance. Rice glanced toward the eastern road as another horn answered, harsh and urgent. "The high houses have heard the decree," he warned. "Their banners are already gathering at the palace." Elara tightened her grip on Lucian's hand. This time, neither of them turned away. By sunset, the capital gates stood open beneath a sky the color of cooling steel. Rainwater streamed from the carved wolves above the arch, and the bells that had sounded in defiance now fell silent as Lucian's riders entered. Elara rode beside him, wrapped in his black cloak, her bandaged shoulders stiff beneath the wool. No chains waited for her. No hidden passage carried her inside. The ivory dress recovered from the chapel lay across her saddle, its torn fabric dark with dried blood, and every noble gathered in the courtyard could see it. High-house banners crowded the wet stone. Their bearers watched Lucian dismount, expecting a king to command obedience. Instead, he turned to Elara and offered his hand. She studied the palace windows, the faces that had once looked through her, then descended without lowering her eyes. "The throne hall is prepared," Captain Rice said. "So is the opposition." "Let them witness," Elara replied. Inside, braziers hissed against damp air. Lord Valor stood under guard before the throne while the recovered attack plans rested on a silver table, his broken seal beside them. Rice read the charges aloud. Conspiracy against the crown, murder attempted under a council banner, and treason concealed beneath royal law. Witnesses stepped forward. Guards who had hunted Elara removed the traitor's insignia from their uniforms and placed it at her feet. Valor's allies surrendered their seals one by one. No blade was drawn. Their power ended with the quiet scrape of metal against stone. When the final seal fell, Lucian faced the assembled houses. "Elara is innocent. Every order issued against her is revoked. Every accusation is erased." He removed the ceremonial crown from his head and set it beside Valor's seal. A murmur moved through the hall. "The law says a king may choose a noble Luna for the strength of the realm," he continued. "That privilege is abolished. No crown will decide whom another soul is permitted to love." Then he descended the steps, leaving the throne behind him. Elara's fingers tightened around the folded farewell letter hidden in her cloak. Lucian stopped before her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him through the cold hall, but he did not invoke the bond. He did not kneel and claim what fate had named. "You tried to say goodbye because you believed loving you would cost me my kingdom," he said. "I ignored you because I believed the kingdom could not wait." His gaze moved to the bloodstained dress. "I was wrong." From beneath his tunic, he drew the plain silver ring meant for their secret ceremony. "I will not ask you to disappear for my peace again, and I will not ask you to stay for my crown." He placed the ring in her open palm. "Choose freely." The hall held its breath. Elara looked at the throne, at the surrendered seals, and finally at the man who had given up the right to decide for her. Then she crossed to the silver table. Her farewell letter trembled once between her fingers before she lowered its corner into a brazier. Flame traveled across the words she had written in loneliness, curling the parchment into glowing ash. Smoke carried the scent of wax and cedar through the hall. "That goodbye belonged to the woman who thought she had to leave so you could remain king," she said. She returned to Lucian and placed the ring in his hand. "She is not standing here." Lucian's breath caught, but he waited. Elara lifted her own hand. "Ask me now." He sank to one knee on the cold stone, not as Alpha King, but as the man who had finally learned to listen. Elara, with no law compelling you and no fate speaking for you, will you stand beside me? Yes, she whispered. Then, stronger, I choose you. He slid the ring onto her finger. When he rose, she drew him close, and their foreheads touched as the bond warmed between them. Accepted, not obeyed. The houses bent their knees only after Elara turned to face them at Lucian's side. Days later, beneath an open sky washed clean by rain, she wore a new ivory gown sewn from the undamaged fabric of the first. A narrow strip from its blood-stained hem had been cleaned and stitched inside, hidden near her heart, not to preserve the wound, but to remember the price of silence. Lucian listened as she spoke every word of her vow, and when his turn came, his voice carried beyond the palace walls. No goodbye of yours will ever go unheard again. What had once been her final farewell became the first promise they chose together.